about because you're a believer, but just in case someone's watching this replay or you're following instructions and you decide to share this by clicking that arrow and sharing this with someone who needs to have a word right now on Friday, there's a concept of pressure that God allows some of us to go through in life, and that's the pressure that I want to talk about. That's the pressure that I want to talk about. Thank you, Roy. 2 Corinthians 12, 1 through 10. Don't worry to read the whole thing because you're in church. You're not in church or on Instagram. But in verse 8 of 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 8, it says 3 different times, I begged to the Lord to take it away. Each time he said, my grace is sufficient. My grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I'm glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, the hardships, the persecutions, the troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I'm weak, then I am strong. I believe the Passion Translation even says issues and hardships and troubles, inconveniences, all these different things that we go through in life. They are used to create pressure in our life, and how we view them, it can impact our vision. But 3 different times, this man of God in the name of Apostle Paul, he went to God 3 different times about the pressure about the pressure that was going on in his life. In 2 Corinthians 12, 1 through 10. 3 times he went to God. How many times have you gone to God multiple times about something and you only find out that he allowed the thing to stay in your life? Now, I really believe Paul asked God multiple times because he was getting an unusual answer. I mean, who would think that if something's troubling your life and you're a man of faith, a woman of faith, shouldn't you go to God for it to be taken out of your life? Shouldn't you go to God for it to be taken away? Come on, we're talking about pressure points today for everybody on here. And I'm not going to be on here that long. Faith on Friday is a lot shorter. I'm on here for obedience. I'm not on here for cheers, okay? So I'm just on here to hit y'all real quick and deuce, enjoy your weekend. Love y'all so much, though, at the same time. So Paul goes to God about something in his life. What up, Ariel? God goes to God about something in his life, and he gets an unusual answer. The unusual answer that Apostle Paul gets is the same answer that he got the first time. The answer he gets is, each time he said, my grace is all you need. Potentially, Paul could have been negotiating with God about the question. Well, God, you may not give me healing, but can you just give me comfort? God, you may not give me comfort, but can you just tell me a deadline that this concern of mine is going to be eliminated? You may not give me a deadline, but can you just reveal yourself and assure me that it won't be like this always? 3 times he begged God. 3 different times. To take away this thorn that's in his flesh. To take away this problem that's in his life. To take away this hard thing that's in his world. Each time, God says, my grace is all you need. My grace is sufficient, for my power works best in weakness. Paul now has the maturity later on. I believe there's a period after weakness, but I believe there's some time between the next sentence. Even though it's not the next verse, it's the next sentence. It's the next sentence. I believe there was time between, I believe in 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 9, that between that first sentence and that second sentence, there was some maturity that happened. And in verse 9, it says, my power works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses. That took some time. It took some time to boast about his weaknesses. It took some time to be encouraged about a no. It took some time to love a God that allows you to go through some hard things. It took some time to understand his relationship with the Lord outside of it being about God fixing a problem that was designed to mature him, a problem, a thorn in his flesh that was designed to grow him, something going on in his world that he went to God about, that he expected God to get out of his life, but God allowed it to stay in his life. Why? Because it was time for Paul to learn about grace. And I'm here to tell somebody right now that grace is not for immature people, it's for mature people. The next level of his theology was grace. Paul went into his prayer closet, for lack of better words, looking for a change, but instead he left with a challenge. Paul went into his prayer closet looking for a fix, but instead he left with an upgrade in his faith. That for the very first time, he's going to hear God tell him 3 times, over and over and over again, this thing you're coming to me about, Paul, I'm not going to change. It's a pressure point. It's a prophetic pain point in your life that's going to open up promises that I have for you. And the promise I have for you, Paul, in 2 Corinthians 12:9 is a grace that's going to hit your life. Here's the next thing. Grace is not for us to act foolish with. Grace is for hard things. Grace is not elementary. Grace is for times when you hit a wall and you're going to God about something and it looks like you're getting an unanswered prayer, where you have to steward your life and take care of things that God allows you to sit in. So Paul was dealing with a hard thing. The hard thing that Paul was dealing with was God telling him no. Let's talk. The hard thing that Paul was dealing with was God not fixing his problem on his terms. And God's people, for those of you all who are Bible heads on any level, God's people, multiple times in the Word of God, we see that God's people were vetted through hard times. They were groomed and grown and matured by believing in God and waxed by the grace of God under pressure. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, pressure. Daniel in the lion's den, pressure. Esther, scared to talk to her husband, who's a king, pressure. David facing Goliath, but had the question to put on Saul's armor. Took advantage of the opportunity to try it on, but then he realized that his armor is not sufficient for God's grace. Sometimes it's not that God's grace can't sit on you. God's grace is not willing to sit on that while that sits on you. See, it wasn't about David not having grace, but the grace wasn't on Saul's armor. See, that's a whole different story. I'm going to leave y'all alone, but I'm definitely going to give the Favor on a Friday horn for that, because that deserved a horn just now. That deserved a horn. Sometimes it's not that God doesn't have grace for you. God does not have grace for that being for you. And many of us, the pressure we're dealing with is we're always trying to bring so many people into the next room. And God been dealing with me about this statement. And I'm not trying to sound motivational or inspirational, even though most of the time when any preacher or speaker says this, it strikes a chord with all of us. They get turned, we get excited, and we say something like, you can't take them with you. But God told me to look at this through the lens of grace. Not look at this through the lens of being frustrated and mad at friends who betrayed you. Come on, someone say pressure points. And mad at people who let you down. Not look at this from the broken, dysfunctional, motivational statement that inclines our soul to say, I didn't need them anyway. Not look at this statement that I'm about to say from the perspective of the derogatory mention that this person can't come to this next level with me. That's easy. It's easy to be upset at people. But let's look at this through the lens of grace. Here we go, Jay. Check this out. You can't go in there with me, but you can come in there after me. A lot of us, we're trying to take people with us, but we're too scared to climb the ladder of the responsibility of leadership, to go in first and then tell them to come in after. And what's going on with many of you all is if you really loved your friends, oh God. If you really loved your friends, you would disconnect just for a little bit to connect with what God has for you so you can bring them into your new connection if they're willing to go to the next level. But many of us are trying to go through a narrow door, holding hands with 5 people horizontal. You're not going to get through that door. You're going to have to go in first and then tell them, if you really love me back, come into my next level with me. We've been friends. We've been cool, but I'm having grace for hard things. I got pressure points in my life. If you really love me back, if you really want to rock with me, allow me to go through the door that God has for me, and I'll tell you to come in after. Put inside the chat, come in after, come in after, come in after, come in after. A lot of times, we're frustrated in our relationships because God won't let them take them with us. And we can't. They're supposed to come in after us. They're supposed to come in after us. They're supposed to come in after us. The friends that God has for you are okay with following you into a dimension that God's pulling you in. It's not that they can't be cool with you anymore. It's that they're not called to go in first. See? Now we change the whole word. And many of us, we have used this concept of you can't go with me from a negative lens. We allowed the pain of life to make us say that in a prophetic derogatory statement, that you aren't allowed to be in my life no more. And God's not saying that. God's saying, stop sharing your first fruit breakthrough. God's saying, stop giving your tithe to them. The tithe goes to God. Seek first the kingdom of God, and all things he'll add all things to your life. All that stuff comes after. We have people in our life who want to eat when you eat. You got to sit at the table first. Even David invited Saul's grandson or somebody after he got seated at the table. You have to learn to sit down first. You're trying to get everybody to show up on time in your destiny and your breakthrough. You're the only person that has to be on time to your obedience. You're the only person who has to be on time to your obedience. Stop being upset that they didn't get the same list of things to do by God that you did. Stop being upset that they're not showing up on time in your destiny. It doesn't mean you have to cut them off. It just means it's time for you to start your show before they get there. Let them come late. You don't have to cut them off. Just let them be late. I feel led by God to say it again. You don't have to cut them off. Just let them be late. It's better for them to be late than for you to wait. Because if you keep waiting on people who ain't called to be on your time, I feel like if you keep waiting on somebody who's not called to show up when you're supposed to show up, they're never late. You know why? The only one who's late by God is the one that's on that list. And that's your list. That's your destiny. That's your breakthrough. That's your room. That's your next level. And you are waiting on somebody who's not even called to go into the room on the same terms you're called to go into. You're waiting on them to be ready for you to show up when God says you're supposed to show up. And God said it's accounted to you as unfaithfulness. And now you are late to something that you're supposed to be on time with because you're waiting for somebody else to show up in their version of being obedient. And that is crazy. Show up on time to the rooms that God has for you and be okay with your friends and be okay with everybody else jumping on the boat later. God won't count them as unfaithful because they're late, but God will count it as unfaithfulness if you wait. Horn. God will not count your friends unfaithful to being late to what he told you to do. But he will count it as unfaithfulness for you to wait to do the thing that God told you to do because you're trying to bring people with you. You can't keep bringing people with you who are supposed to come in after you. Pressure points. I think I'm going to leave them like this. What up, Cassandra? I see you. Philippians 4 and 12. Paul talks about learning about different things. Someone say pressure points. On this Faith on a Friday weekend, I want to leave you with this. So we can be open to what God's saying to us this weekend and be open to what God's saying to us as we get ready to jumpstart the next week. So you can just be okay with your weekend. Be okay with some of y'all may want to stay inside. Some of you may want to go to some events. Some of you may have some things on your schedule. But Philippians 4 and 12, the same guy, Paul, that I talked about earlier, says, I know how to be abased. This New King James Version. And I know how to abound. Why? Let's talk about it in a little bit. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. Pressure points that God allows to stay in our life are access points for us to learn God. 2 Corinthians 12, 1 through verse 10, New Living Translation is your homework. Paul went to God 3 times asking for a change. Each time God left him with a challenge. He was called to learn about God differently. He was called to upgrade his theology. Theology, you all, just means the knowledge of God. When Paul left in 2 Corinthians 12, that's why he says, I boast. Now I boast about my weaknesses. Now I boast about this. Now I boast about that. Now I boast about this. Now I boast about my weakness. Now I boast about insults. Now I boast about troubles. He's not boasting about revelation because he already learned that. He's always boasting about the new things he learns about God versus his accomplishments that he made by God. How do you know when someone has revelation and they're in sync with God? They're always telling you about new ways God's correcting them and chiseling them. Your life should be bigger than your resume. If you're a believer, your excitement, your boasting should be bigger than your resume. You should have some things about your life that are just revelation. It's not accomplishments. This is not an accomplishment. This actually here is an area in my life that God's correcting me in. And I'm going to give you some of this oil. When Paul writes in Philippians 4 and 12, he's saying he's a lifelong God learner. He's a lifelong God learner. No matter if he's an apostle, no matter if he's seen Jesus at the road to Damascus, no matter how much he's intellectual, no matter how articulate he is, no matter how many degrees and languages he can speak, and even if he's before Caesar and before all these great leaders and all these miracles and signs and wonders that happen upon his life, he is decreeing, declaring to us today that he's a lifelong God learner. That he learned how to abound and abase. He's in the will of God, but there were some days he didn't have no money. He's in the will of God, but there's some days he had a lot of money. He's in the will of God, and some days he was hungry. He's in the will of God, and some days he was full. We have to learn how to worship God, praise God, and stay in relationship with God when things are good and when things are bad. God cannot continue to pour out his Chuck E. Cheese blessings to your life when you're too old to get inside Chuck E. Cheese. He can't keep, even when you go to Carowinds, there's some rides that are for little kids. And there's some rides that are for big kids. And they bring you up to the measuring point. And if you are not at the height to fit inside the protection of that next level ride, they won't put you on the ride. You could go on a ride, but the security that's designed on the roller coaster is designed for someone who has made it to a certain season of life where they have a certain size. Some of y'all are trying to ride a blessed season that you're not strong enough to handle. Some of you are trying to get on a ride with God and you're mad at God. And he's like, you're not tall enough yet. I love you too much. What love is when my child, my 3-year-old is crying and he's whining and he's upset because he wants some more sugar. But I know sugar at night's not good for him. It's time to go to bed. Love is when I leave you in your tears so that you can be happy in your years. Okay? It's God is maturing many of us right now. You're like Apostle Paul. You've been begging God for something. You've been asking God for something. You feel like your prayers have been on repeat mode. And God said, I'm 2 Corinthians 12, 1 through 10 in you right now. Put that inside the chat form. I'm growing you up. I'm growing you up. I didn't come on here to preach, but y'all bringing it out of me. I'm growing you up. I'm growing you up. I'm growing you up. I'm growing you up. And God's like, whenever you're ready, to stop bringing it up, whenever you're ready to stop bringing it up and making a decision to walk in the grace. Whenever you're ready to stop bringing it up and make a decision to walk in the grace. Because I'm going to say the same thing. Each time he answered me, my grace is sufficient. For my power works best in weakness. What is God really saying to you? Or can we not hear him because our ears are being drowned out by how loud we have a prayer request? And we're asking God over and over and over and over and over. He's telling you right now, I'm trying to give you grace for the hard things. God's upgrading many of our theology. And so on this Faith on a Friday, this conversation, this thought that I have, that I'm currently teaching on Sunday mornings, that I'm unpacking with you all now, called Pressure Points. God has me in the place to learning that sometimes God has elevated your maturity because now you're mature enough for him to tell you no. Oh my God. It wasn't no when you were young, but it's now no that you're grown. I'm going to prove it to you. Sometimes my 13-year-old son tells me that, why you do that for here or you won't do that for us? Like, why? And I get it. He's right to a certain degree. But when they're young, they get away with little different things. When they're young, a good parent understands that a 3-year-old going to do certain things. But if a 13-year-old tries to do it, if a 13-year-old has a fit and throws some yogurt on the ground, you going to your room, I'm taking PlayStations, give me your cell phone. If a 50-year-old yells to the top of their lungs because they're upset in your own home, what you going to do? Are you going to answer them and baby them and reassure them that you love them? Or are you going to make them think about what they screaming about? Exactly. Many of us want God to keep us in a toddler season. Where's the horn? Check this out. I'll end on this. Happy Faith on a Friday. Check this out. It's not that God's no longer answering you. He's just no longer answering that version of you. He has nothing to say to you when you have a fit with him. And God said, you are older than that. Whenever you're ready to talk to me, like Jesus, even Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, check this out. God didn't even answer Jesus. Jesus answered himself. He said, you know what? Never, why am I asking God an elementary question? can this cup pass me? He's been telling me all these years of ministry since I've been on earth. The Lord, heavenly, my Father has told me that I'm here. I come to lay my life down. I was sent to die on a cross for their sins. Why am I now bringing up an elementary question? Can this cup pass me? What happens? He gets into his own maturity. Jesus himself upgrades his theology, answers himself, nevertheless, not my will be done, but your will be done. Grace for the hard thing. Be blessed. Comment below if this blessed you. Share this with someone who blessed you. Let's embrace the pressure points that God has given us, because that prophetic pain in our lives may release prophetic promises. Keep the faith. Be blessed.